Hello, my name is Valerie Derman, and I am here with Professor Emmanuel Brunet-Jailly from the University of Victoria to talk about the EU's regional policy. To get things started, what is the EU's regional policy and why is it important?
So the whole idea of the EU regional policy started in the 1950s when the EU elite basically had a worry that economic integration would further increase disparities across the various EU regions. In other words, that as the EU integrates economically, right, all the member states and the more than 280 regions, the regions that were the winning regions already at the time would be creating even greater gaps of growth and wealth, and that the poorer region would really struggle. And so the idea was that there should be some forms of policies that would, in a way, remedy this. And this is important because it's one of the three questions that we're asking in this book, right? Is there, in the policies, an impact or a demonstration, rather, of state solidarity? And in the chapter 11, I discuss this to illustrate how the policies, the regional, then called also coherence policy, cohesion policy, actually lead to and demonstrate a form of solidarity. But another aspect which is very important is that it shows us that in the EU, neither the states nor the market completely controls economic growth and the development, the economic development of the European Union. So these are the various aspects, the reasons and the various aspects behind the policy. The policies have evolved, and this is in a way something that we're going to come to discuss a bit more, but they started as basically very straightforward policies of economic development in various areas of the economy. But today they really are focused on innovation, sustainability, and some forms of inclusiveness as well. In other words, if you read behind the words, there is a real desire to see new discoveries and innovation happen thanks to the funding and the regulation around that. There is also a very clear ecological goal and a social solidarity goal, right? The idea of inclusiveness, which, as we will discuss a bit more, you'll see, has been a major challenge.
In broad strokes, how have the objectives of the EU's regional policy changed over the years? What are the main objectives today?
For the first 20 years, you basically have policies of redistribution. And these are policies where the money goes back to the states. And it's very clear in many negotiations. For instance, when the UK wanted to negotiate its entry into the EU, there was such negotiations over, well, what kind of funding would we get back, right? And there's a very well-known discussion between Margaret Thatcher and François Mitterrand at the time over that, that very specific question. But very progressively in the 1990s, so actually starting as early as 1988, 89, you see an evolution of the policies towards the Mediterranean states. So Spain and Portugal and Italy. And these funds actually are much more, in a way, designed and driven by what the European Commission wants to see done on the ground than they are driven by Spain or Portugal or Italy, right? And Greece further, down the road. And where the European Commission really, as it is done today, right, to answer the question that you raised, how does it work today, is that the European Commission creates forms of, in a way, partnership, sophisticated networks that include municipalities, counties, regions, sometimes across boundaries, right? Across the internal boundaries of the EU. And where those policies have, in a way, great success. And the states, in a way, are squeezed in there because it happens that local actors, whether they are, mayors or regional councillors or county members and so on and so forth, or even the private sector, they see that those policies can really serve them well. As the EU does this, implement the policies, it also implements more, in a way, regulations to limit the ability the richer regions have to become even more successful thanks to those policies. And so what we see happening is that the European Commission, along with the objectives, is able to implement regulatory systems, but also access to funding that is more, in a way, constraining for the richer regions and the richer cities. And in that way, one can say or argue that you have forms of cohesion, and that the EU cohesion policies are fairly successful. Recently, people around the world, when they looked at the EU cohesion policies, have started to talk about the largest economic development policies in the world, right? Because when you look at the impact of the funding, which is controversial, by the way, but when you look at the impact of the funding, what you see is 347 billion, for instance, right, in the last few years, invested in the regions of Europe, which, by the way, represents 3% of GDP. It's considerable amount of money being reinvested in the different regions.
How does the EU's regional policy work in practice? What are the various actors and political levels involved in decision-making?
That's a very important question, because one of the things, that I discussed up front is the role of the states. Obviously, the states are involved, right? The states at first control the funding. Very quickly from the 1990s, obviously, as discussed, also you see that regions actually play a very important role, and the cities as well. And in some regions, counties, or networks of municipalities play a role. And I would say that this kind of governance and the ability of bringing together, in a way, a form of economic development plan, right, across these different actors, multi-level governance of actors, right, networks of partners working together, is one of the great success of the regional policies. But most recently, I think what is a real breakthrough is the appearance and systematic appearance of the private sector, where you see these networks of partnership, sophisticated networks of partnership, that include private sector, investment firms that are from the private sector, and basically are one of the critical ally of these traditional networks of investments. And it actually is so important to realize this and the complexity of these networks, but also their level of specialization. We are talking about all kind of partnership, not just the construction of a bridge, right? But it could be, for instance, investment in very specific technological infrastructures, which require different forms of investments from different types of private sector firms, as well as the local level, municipalities and universities and research centers and so on and so forth, right? So these very sophisticated networks now, in a way, drive these regional policies, and they have taken away a little bit the leadership, not only just the states, which was quite clear until the 1990s, but also from the regional level governments, right? Because in some instances, what is most important is the quality of the partnership network and the level of sophistication. And it has led to a debate about, obviously, the impact of the policies, but it also led a debate about whether the solidarity and the effectiveness of the policy was real. In other words, we're questioning one of the things that I was saying at first, is that, is it market-led now, or is it state-led, or how does it work, right? So this is kind of where we are at right now.
Thank you. There are divergent positions on whether the EU's regional policy has been successful. Can you explain the most important arguments in this debate? What would be your own assessment?
Yeah, so that's a very important question too, and it's a fairly recent one. I would say that, the debates recent, it would have about 20 years, right? But the regional policies obviously are much older than that. And so if we assume they started in 1970s, right, they have made about almost 55 years, and the last 20 years we've really had serious discussions about their impact. So one of the things that have been studied is whether, for instance, regional policies have created jobs, right? The idea that regional policies have, this social solidarity, this inclusiveness part of it, right? Is it inclusive growth? Right now, there are lots of people who question this. It's not the only area. Can we demonstrate that regional policies, for instance, contribute to more innovation or greater leap in investments, for instance? In other words, that they really contribute to a greater economic growth across the EU. All these questions, if you do research on this, you'll realize that it's almost a nasty debate, right? Sometimes it's even methodological. You have people who argue that yes, they create jobs, yes, they provide serious, competitive investments, and there are people who say, well, we're not so sure. But ultimately, when you look at meta analysis, in other words, you summarize, let's say, 2,000 economics paper on this, what you realize is that what remains critical is that these policies have contributed to a new form of governance and relationship among economic development actors. In other words, that the core of the policy is obviously some economic success, which is quite clear, but also the fact that it's the growth of all of the networked regions of Europe. And that even the richer regions, but also the poorest ones, are really keen in being involved and really want to participate, right? And so the European Directorate in charge of these policies have often talked about how they have created an original form of governance, and that's been very successful. What do I think about them? I think that these policies have evolved drastically, and I think that we cannot really discuss them as redistributive policies, right? They're not policies of equalization. They're not policies in a way similar to the Canadian ones where, you get a check. Each state or each region gets a check to pay some of its existing policies. These are policies where the European Union policy goals in terms of economic development has basically turned cohesion into investment policy. So rather than redistribution, these are allocational policies. These are policies whereby the EU agrees to fund and to co-fund innovative, sustainable, and inclusive projects that partner across large territories, sometimes across international boundaries, involving poorer peripheries as well as networks of cities, including the largest, richest cities, right? Because obviously there is great disparity.
How does regional policy in Canada compare to regional policy in the EU?
In Canada, we have very different words. We use very different, in a way, concept to discuss regional policies. Even the idea of multi-level governance, which I've discussed a little bit and obviously is important in the chapter, is something that remains, in a way, unexplored in Canada. We talk about intergovernmental relations, right? And it's basically intergovernmental to the extent that we have federal-provincial discussions. Even the cities, even the richest cities, like Vancouver or Toronto, Edmonton and Calgary and Winnipeg and Montreal, are not really part of this discussion. So in Canada, the policies are mostly of equalization, whereby the federal government makes and forces the richest provinces to pay for provincial programs in poorer provinces. So obviously there is a strong solidarity effect, right? There is a strong example of solidarity, which by the way also exists in the EU. But it happens that the province in Canada have much more say than the states do in the EU, right? In the EU, the states in a way have lost the ability to design the objectives of the policy. It's a discussion between the Commission and the region. In Canada, the provinces in a way remain the drivers, obviously in partnership with the federal government. But certainly I would argue that the policy-making process in Canada is less structured than it is in the EU, where the regional policies lead to hundreds of hours of committee and negotiation on a yearly basis, right? And that if you're a regional actor, you can be sure that you have a vice president. If you are a mayor, you can, especially of a large city, you can be sure that you will have a deputy mayor or somebody and staff people that are involved in the negotiation, ongoing negotiations of those policies and their impact. So you can see these differences, right? Canada provinces dominate, probably a little less integrated than it is in the US, structurally integrated than it is in Europe.